People sometimes ask me, who's your favourite Western movie star? And I think they expect me to say John Wayne or maybe Clint Eastwood or someone. And I always say Randolph Scott, and they're somewhat surprised because he's not perhaps thought of as in the first rank. He's not the first person you might think of as somebody's favourite Western star, unless they're just exclusively into B movies and things. And then I, have to think about why that's my choice and what is it about Randolph Scott that I like so much. And at first I think there are a lot of fairly kind of negative virtues. I mean, he's not flamboyant. He doesn't wear fancy clothes. He doesn't do kind of fancy gunplay and horse riding stunts and that sort of thing. He's very laid back. He's a man of few words, though well chosen, thanks to Burt Kennedy and other competent scriptwriters. He's not a ladies' man. So what is it, that really draws me towards him? And I think if Randolph Scott had retired in the mid-50s, or a little bit earlier, he would be thought of as just one amongst many Western movie stars who populated the B-Westerns and series Westerns of the 40s and 50s. Better than most, maybe, but not necessarily particularly remarkable. And his early career doesn't really give you many clues as to sort of what's coming at the end. I think a lot of Western stars are better at the end than at the beginning. Certainly, say, John Wayne, his later films, not so much The Searchers, although that certainly stands out, but even a film like his last film, The Shootist, is a very considerable film, I think, and he's very good in it. I think that Unforgiven is Clint Eastwood's best Western, But with Randolph Scott, it's particularly the case that his early career doesn't really lead you to expect anything particularly great at the end. Born in Virginia, brought up in North Carolina, he's a man of the South, which I think is significant for part of his career, the kind of roles that he got. He's often a Southern gentleman. He starts off in the late 20s, like many Hollywood people. I think he gets into pictures by accident. He trained as a textile engineer, of all things. But he doesn't really start off as a Western star at all. He's in the early 1930s, he's playing in Hollywood comedies. He does a couple of Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers musicals, of all things, though he doesn't sing or dance. But he's playing light comedy. He's a kind of bachelor about town. He shares a house with Cary Grant for a while. And he's in a range of mostly comedies and light dramas. Then along comes the war. He makes a few war pictures, occasional Western, but it's not until the post-war period that he gets to be primarily identified as a Western star. And from about the mid-40s, the late 40s, he's doing nothing but Westerns. That's all he's doing. And they're kind of what I might call fairly high-grade B-Westerns. That is to say, he stars with a number of all those character actors who are in all those Westerns, Trevor Burdett and Gabby Hayes and all those guys who keep turning up in the bit parts. And he's obviously got making a decent living, making 4 or 5 Westerns a year, which you sense don't particularly kind of stretch him. It's the sort of work that he could do day in, day out without feeling particularly taken out of himself very much. And I think he gets to the middle of the 1950s with dozens of these films. You know, he made over 100 pictures in his career. So by the middle of the 50s, he's himself getting into later 50s. He's already into advanced middle age. And he's still churning out these kind of pictures. Then he makes a number of westerns with André de Toth, who was a good director, better than most that Randolph Scott had worked with up to that point. And they're quite good. They're a cut above what he'd previously done, but they don't really kind of tax him. And the roles that he plays are fairly uncomplicated. They're not characters who have a great deal of depth to them, and mostly he's required to do kind of a lot of action scenes and, you know, riding around and fist fights and stuff like that. And then quite suddenly it seems as though he gets in with the right people and starts to make some films which are definitely a cut above anything he's done before. And I think the first film you would pick on as being really distinctive is a film that he made in the middle 50s called Seven Men From Now, which has a script by Burt Kennedy, who scripted what I think are, by general consent, Randolph Scott's best films. And it's directed by Bud Bettaker, and everything picks up from there. But it is the first film, I think, in which the authentic Randolph Scott persona emerges, ushered onto the screen by the combined talents of Bud Bettaker and Burt Kennedy. And it's a character that is, you have to say, marked by grief. There are, in so many of those films, something bad has happened to Randolph Scott in the past. And he is intent on, as he sees it, putting things to right as best he can. He's intent on some kind of revenge, which may or may not save him, but he's going to carry it out, whether it's, you know, good for him or whether he'd be do better to just walk away and forget about things. But he's determined to see this through. And it's more than sadness in his character, I think. There's a kind of tragedy, as though his life has been broken, and that's responsible for his demeanor, which is very taciturn, very reserved, very reluctant to give opinions or show emotions. Somebody who basically has relapsed into a kind of stoicism, which is not quite despair. He's saved from despair by the burning desire for revenge, but his life seems to have been almost, you know, destroyed by this event in the past, and all he can do now is to track down those people responsible for it. The three later scripts by Burt Kennedy are The Tall T, Ride Lonesome, and Comanche Station. And in them, Scott comes to the full flower of his kind of mature personality, and the character is difficult company, I think, for the other people in the picture, but at the same time, there is an innate respect. I think in certain respects, you can see Eastwood as having some elements of the Randolph Scott persona. They're very kind of similar figures physically. They're tall, quite thin. They don't put on weight as they get older, unlike John Wayne, who by the end of his films is sort of waddling around the screen, really not looking very graceful. But Randolph Scott and Clint Eastwood have managed to, you know, keep that kind of lean, kind of rangy look that seems to suit the Westerner. And he is similarly notorious for being kind of tight-lipped and not, you know, whereas, I mean, there are certain Western stars like John Wayne in certain moods and James Stewart, for example, who is positively garrulous at times, you know, which Scott and Eastwood never are. They confine themselves to fairly laconic, kind of lapidary statements, which you remember, like, some things a man can't ride around, you know, and statements like that, which are statements of their philosophy, if you like, encapsulated in a single sentence. So that, I think whether Eastwood ever modelled himself on Randolph Scott, I don't know. I've never heard him mention Scott as any kind of a role model. Thinking about antecedents, Jim Kitses, in his book Horizons West, points out that the great French critic André Bazin remarked that Randolph Scott was very reminiscent of William S. Hart, the early silent Western star. And there are shots of Randolph Scott. I was looking the other day at, I think it was The Tall Tea. There are some particular shots where he really looks remarkably like William S. Hart. He's got the same kind of hairstyle going across the forehead like this, and that same kind of look somehow. And again, whether Randolph Scott would have ever modelled himself on William S. Hart, I don't know. I mean, I doubt it. But then, you know, you don't necessarily have to deliberately model yourself on someone to pick up aspects, you know, of, I mean, by contrast, you know, he certainly didn't model himself on Tom Mix, for example, you know, who would be the absolute opposite to William S. Hart in terms of their kind of persona, really. Altogether flamboyant, whereas Hart is always very kind of restrained, and like Randolph Scott, very kind of spare in his clothing, his outfit, and his general kind of demeanour. And possibly Randolph Scott has something in common with William S. Hart in terms of their attitude to women, which is deferential, respectful, quite the opposite of Tom Mix, for example, who is always something of a flirt. After Randolph Scott had completed his work with Bud Betiker, he made one more film, which was directed by Sam Peckinpah, the second Western that he made. And in it, he co-stars with Joel McCrea, who had a very similar career, started out in Hollywood in the 30s making comedies and working for Preston Sturges and people like that. And then from the later 40s, basically made nothing but Westerns until he finally retired with. And in 1962, Ride the High Country was the last film that Randolph Scott made, and the first film in which they starred together. And it's an interesting film to compare and contrast to the Betiker-Kennedy films. In it, Randolph Scott plays a character who he's moved beyond the kind of stoicism of the previous role into a kind of cynicism. And he tries to persuade Joel McCrea. They have both in the past been lawmen, but they haven't made much money at it. And they get one last job, which is to escort a shipment of gold down from the mountains. And Randolph Scott tries to persuade Joel McCrea that they should steal it as a kind of, you know, they're owed this for their careers. And in the film, Randolph Scott is altogether, he's not just cynical, he's kind of, he makes a lot of jokes. There's a lot of humor in the role. He's very kind of light-hearted, despite the fact that he has got this crooked scheme in his head. And what we see is a kind of side of him that perhaps is not so much in evidence in the earlier Betiker films, except that what's very striking, I think, is in The Tall Tea. In that film, there's a kind of a halfway through, he not changes his character exactly, but we see the other side of the character. He's been happy-go-lucky, cheerful, jovial, and then suddenly, you know, after this tragedy, he becomes implacable and frightening, really, in his intensity and determination. I mean, he's somebody who didn't seem to have a lot of inner life somehow, off-screen or on-screen. The inner life is fascinating, you know, but off-screen, I got the impression that he was a very easy guy to work with, Randolph Scott, because he did what you told him to do. And he was very professional, you know, kind of guy who would always hit his marks and always knew his lines and, you know, could be relied upon. And that was that, you know, he did the work and then he went home, as far as I could make out. I was reading some interview and with one of the people he worked with, and they said, well, what was he like? And they said, well, he was just a friendly guy, and sort of, you know, when he wasn't shooting on the set, what was he doing? And the guy said, he was reading the Wall Street Journal. He said, that's the kind of guy he was. You know? And they said, and what does he do now? Because after he retired, 62, he lived to be 89, and so he lived for another 25 years after he retired. And they said, well, what does he do now? And the guy said, well, I think he just does his stocks and shares, you know.